Bosses in video games are like bosses in real life. Large, imposing, and will most likely drop some sweet loot when defeated, just without the obvious legal repercussions. Also, like your real boss, Clive, there is a right and wrong way to boss. For better or worse, boss fights are a highlight of a game, and will either be remembered for the greatness, like Senator Armstrong, or loathed for eternity, like the Bed of Chaos. Join me as we go through my personal do's and don'ts for boss fights. But let me first say, I have zero game design experience, and these are based on too long spent playing video games. Got it? Good. A boss should be a test of what the player has learned thus far. It should be a gauge by which the player can see how much they've improved, and not just using the dungeon item on the boss. I'm looking at you, Legend of Zelda, you tunic-wearing nerd. Gee, I wonder where to aim. Is it the red glowing weak spot? I bet it is, you piece of sh. Anyway, to give you an idea, let's use Dark Souls as an example. Really get used to hearing that FromSoft, for the most part, do understand what makes a good boss. Starting at the very beginning, the Asylum Demon, after you go through the area, expects you to call on everything in the tutorial messages to progress. From then until Ornstein and Smo, because the game falls off a cliff in the second half, the game slowly tests you on your application of those basics, your situational awareness, your patience, and how much of the game you're willing to abuse to get your own way. All the way to Gwyn, Lord of Parry Practice. But he's the end game, and we all know that's the video game equivalent of a map painting at this point. Make sure the boss is readable. Now, I'm not saying the boss needs to spend 84 years winding up an attack, but they should have something in their animations that lets the player know that they're preparing the anus macerator and react accordingly. Something that triggers pattern recognition somewhere in the grey matter. However, this shouldn't be an excuse to make an attack need pixel perfect dodges. You should never expect perfection from a player because that gets super boring. Make sure the boss actually makes sense. And no, I don't mean the boss can't be balls to the wall, absolutely absurdly batshit insane, because quite frankly, those things are some of the best fights in gaming. I'm talking more making sure the boss actually suits what's going on in the game, in lore and location. It's not very common for games to get this so wrong that you're left trying to figure out what on earth is going on, but when they do, it's almost always the final boss for some sodding reason. Here's a classic one for you, the Destroyer from Borderlands 1. There is basically no lead up. The villain that's been hounding you the entire game opens the vault and is immediately killed by a grotesque tentacle blob that the game just expects you to accept. And there's a large chunk of bosses in Dark Souls 2 that do this, but specifically the Covetous Demon. He's just kind of there, in the middle of the basement of a windmill. You only discover his lore after killing him, and all it is that he's a simp, and they got really fat and turned into a demon for some fucking reason. Boss fights should be a spectacle. Do you know what the difference is between a mini-boss and a full-fledged boss? Presentation! The venue should be grand, the visual stunning, and the music should be torn from the hands of God himself. I am talking hyperbole, obviously, but a boss fight should feel special and should set the mood correctly, so everything needs to come together. If one thing is off, it can undermine everything. Would Gwyn have had the same impact if you fought him in a dark alleyway? Or if your duel with Jetstream Sam was accompanied by the Moonlight Sonata? Does it have to be perfect? Absolutely not. But consideration should be made to make sure it's the best it can be and not super jarring for the player. Now that you've looked at what makes a good boss, let's talk about some of the daft shit that boss fights should probably never do, but constantly do because of course they do. Repeating the same boss multiple times. Guys, we all love donuts, right? If you said no, you do for the sake of this analogy. Say you polish off a lovely glazed ring after dinner, go to bed, and then wake up in the morning and there's another glazed donut waiting for you. And then for lunch, another one. Eventually, you're going to get bored of the sugary treat, and that's what a repeat boss feels like. No matter how good they are, or how much fun the fight is, doing the exact same fight multiple times kind of cheapens the experience and just smacks of lazy design. While I love their games, FromSoft is guilty of this a lot. Dark Souls 2 has several instances of this. The bulk of Elden Ring's boss fights are repeats, and even Dark Souls 1 does this with 3 slightly different asylum demons. That being said, there is a way to do this right. The rival boss is at its core a repeat boss. However, it changes things and adds other moves and mechanics to the mix that it still feels fresh. And let's be real, they are normally some of the best fights in a game. Bosses that artificially extend the fight. We're talking regen, bosses that run away, boss fights where the area looks like Glastonbury. It's especially annoying because most of the time, the boss itself is pathetically weak and just uses cheap tricks, tomfoolery, and general chicanery to pad out the fight. Most of the time. And it typically makes an already mediocre experience a tedious one. There isn't much to do for regenning or fleeing bosses to make them better. There isn't just giving the player the option to remove those mechanics. But the gank or add boss can be done well, and let's use the best example in recent history. The Dukes of Dunkage themselves, it's Ornstein and Smo, ladies and gentlemen. The reason this fight is so good is actually really simple. Ornstein is small and fast, and Smo is big and slow. Got a nice little yin-yang thing going on. This is important because the threat is almost always split. A lot of gank bosses are super annoying because they just rush you down stampede style and you're constantly dealing with 2 or more attackers. But here, Ornstein is the constant threat and Smo is a looming one. He's there, but with careful movement and patience, their time together is minimized. It is such a simple solution, one that FromSoft obviously completely forgot when they made the Godskin duo. That was fast for a fat guy, huh? Timed bosses. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum, we have bosses that really have to be somewhere. Got an important meeting at 6 and they can't possibly miss it. So you're on the clock, otherwise you just die. Because reasons. And this wouldn't normally be an issue if it weren't for the fact that they do everything in their power to drag this fight out. You've got to try as hard as you can to break through the bullshit. It's just super annoying. But again, it can be done well. The first fight with Wesker in RE5, for example.
7 minutes. 7 minutes is all I can spare to play with you.
This isn't a joke, by the way. You have literally 7 in-game minutes to beat him. But due to his matrix-dodging shenanigans, you have to hide and wait for him to walk around the corner to actually hurt him. And when that 7 minutes is up, the fight ends. He just leaves. No game over or anything. He really wasn't lying about that time limit. You can beat him in that time limit with a liberal application of excessive firepower to land a sweet gem. But other than that, you don't have to actually beat him. Forced loss bosses. Ah, the old JRPG staple. I'd go out on a limb and say pretty much every JRPG in history has had a boss, typically near the start, that just wipes the floor with your party, completely paints you across the walls, something to just really smash your confidence. And this kick to the ego would be absolutely fine if the game ever told you these fights were unwinnable. It's not like you can just frame the character as Steve Killington the Undefeatable, because JRPGs have this annoying habit of letting you win a fight just to lose said fight in a cutscene. The only good example I can think of is the first encounter with Jetstream Sam at the start of Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, because it never gives you the illusion that the fight is winnable. You can't hit him, he has no health bar, and you have no healing items to prolong the beatdown. There really aren't a lot of ways to make this type of boss fight better, other than just throwing up a sign at the start of the fight explicitly stating that you aren't going to win this, so don't try. Or we could just stop doing this altogether. That would be nice. QTE bosses. We've all experienced it, getting hyped up for the big climactic battle. Kitted out with the best gear, all your resources are stacked up and ready to go. You walk into the boss room, and the fight is over in a couple of seconds because it only amounts to a few button presses. And a lot of the time, it's the final boss because the devs got really lazy, I suppose. There are two major reasons this type of boss is really bad. First, it's boring as hell. To take the final boss, for example, you want a knockdown, drag-out fight. Something that screams, this dude is the big bad. When you make it a QTE, you kill practically all hype in an instant, which is never a good thing for a boss in general. Secondly, and possibly the most egregious reason, you take the player completely out of the game. They are, in essence, just watching a slightly interactive cutscene. It's no longer them fighting the boss, they're just watching the protag fight them instead, which again, as final bosses are often victim of this, would leave a sour taste in their mouths. Now, you're probably thinking, there are no examples of a QTE boss done right, aren't you? How could it possibly be good if the player has no real input? I hear you cry. But what if I told you there was not just a boss fight that did it well, but an entire game? Allow me to introduce Asura's Wrath. Every major fight in this game is handled primarily in QTEs, but let me use the Argus fights to highlight my point. Every input from the QTEs is visceral, like there's actually impact to what you're doing and you're actually affecting what happens in game, rather than just press X and Y happens. The player is still engaged with what's happening on screen, and even if we ignore that, this fight encapsulates the boss fights should be a spectacle rule from earlier in the video. You are fighting your old mentor on the moon in an all-out slugfest while Symphony number 9 in E minor is playing. It's so balls to the wall insane that I honestly can't imagine there is any way to make this bad. Ultimately, these don'ts aren't going to completely ruin a boss fight just by stint of existing. Like everything, you put enough thought into it and you can make just about anything work. But it is honestly just going to make it harder to make a good or interesting experience if you go down these roads. Just stop with the unwinnable bosses, please. Just make a cutscene instead. And there we have it, people. Follow these extremely vague suggestions and you'll probably have a good boss on your hands. Or don't. I'm not your dad, you can probably make cool fights without me. I hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, subscribe, and let me know if I missed anything in the comments below. I am the Resident Gremlin, and I'll see you next time.